Meeting to order. This is a joint transportation and special call committee of the whole meeting. Today is Monday, November 22nd. It's roughly 2 p.m. First item of business today is approval of our minutes from the October 13th, 2021 meeting. If there are no additions or corrections, we'll entertain a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That motion passes. First, the next item of business is a new application from Mr. Darius Barlow for Sleek Luxury Car Service, applying for a certificate of public necessity and convenience. Detective Pitts, do you want to speak to this item?
Mr. Chairman, we have a new application for a executive sedan service, Sleek Luxury Car Service. Mr. Chairman, this applicant has submitted all paperwork, and I have reviewed the application, supporting the documents, and this applicant can move forward with the application.
All right. Do we have any questions from the committee? Is the applicant present? Mr. Barlow? So you just be operating an executive sedan service, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. The mic is not that sensitive, so you have to kind of talk right into it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions? All right. Do we have a motion?
Move approval.
Second?
Second.
All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow.
Thank you.
That'll be recommended to the full council, and Detective Pitts will usually 1 or 2 weeks before that appears on the council agenda.
I believe it's, yes, sir. It's 2 weeks. I believe it's 2
Okay,
weeks.
2 weeks. So it'll be on the council agenda in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I got it.
All right. Next up on our agenda is a presentation regarding revisions to our taxi ordinance. Attorney Bernard and Mr. Fowler and/or Mr. Fowler.
Yes, sir, and thank you, committee. So again, my name is James Fowler. I serve as the director of the city's Department of Transportation. And we were recently approached by a taxi cab operator that is interested in kind of modernizing the taxi cab industry in Birmingham, as has been done, I believe, in several other cities. In particular, by that, I mean taxi cabs, according to our ordinance, are still required to operate using taxi meters, for example. They're required to have the top light. They're very traditional looking taxis and are pretty heavily regulated. And so what he would like to do, and what a company that would like to move to Birmingham in particular would like to do, is still operate a taxi cab service, yet operate it with more modern technology. So for example, an app that allows you to book the taxi cab, and you can actually track your costs and fees and pay with your phone on using an app, as opposed to having to pay in cash or with a credit card, in the taxi itself. And so with that in mind, Attorney Bernard and I went through this with some of the representatives that were interested in doing that, and have made some modifications. And so just to summarize, some of the modifications that are included in here are things like removing a requirement to have a taxi meter, so you can alternatively use a GPS-based tracking and payment system. So you have to have either a meter or a GPS-based app. You no longer have to have the top light, so all the cars would have to be clearly marked and consistently marked, but you would not have to have the top light. One of the reasons for that is it affects the resale value of the car if they have to drill holes in the top of the car, and so they ask for some flexibility with that. And I think there's a little bit more flexibility granted with the paint scheme in there as well. So that's the basis for the proposed changes to the taxi cab ordinance, is to allow for a more modernized form of taxi cab service.
So in reading through the ordinance, it previously required that the information that we require to be on the taxi, that it actually required painting specifically, and that has been, is proposing to be amended to strike that word painted. Do we know what the operator is planning to do in replacement for painting?
So I think one of the options that they would consider, so one of the ways that they can operate more efficiently is by not permanently altering the vehicle. And so like either a magnetic decal or something that clearly identifies it, but doesn't involve the vehicle having to be repainted.
Yeah, but it would still be clearly marked as a taxi with operators, permit number and all of that kind of stuff that's kind of spelled out in the ordinance.
Correct. Julie Bernard with the Office of City Attorney. They did ask to remove the requirement that the word taxi cab or taxi be on the lettering, but still require that it have, the name of the company and the other, the number of the cab, other information. They wanted the word taxi out for some reason, but.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the only reason that it matters is because they do, because they're a taxi, you can hail this, vehicle from wherever you are, and they can, post up at taxi stands. So, there does need to be distinguishing, something that distinguishes the vehicles from any other vehicle. So I think that's just an important safety consideration.
If the committee wants to keep the word taxi or taxi cab in there, we can, put that back in, and that's the decision of the committee. These were the changes modified, from what they asked. They didn't get everything exactly as they asked for it, but these were, their suggested changes, and that, would be if the committee wants the word taxi or taxi cab, it's still going to have the name and some identifying information on it. And some vehicles that you don't hail, like a limousine service or things like that, aren't going to have all that painting on it as it is. So,
right. Are they proposing to use the same branding that's, shown?
Yes, my understanding is the handout that we provided, that's the company that wants to come in and operate, and so I just wanted the committee to see that as an example. And my understanding from our discussions is they're already operating in Mobile, and they've got several other locations, but that they are operating in Mobile, and they've taken over the major taxi provider in a lot of cities, and not a lot, but a few cities in the kind of South Midwest and Southeast.
Yeah. Another thing that they're asking for is to be not excluded from doing non-emergency medical transport. Can you kind of explain the rationale behind that?
Well, my guess is probably some of that happens anyway, because, if I call a taxi and say I need a ride somewhere, and if I don't tell them I'm going to my doctor's office, they don't know. So I suspect, that happens as it is. I think those who want to directly provide non-emergency, and I looked, the Medicaid reimbursement does not exclude use of a taxi to be transported, for a medical appointment or something like that. So, again, that's what they had asked. I don't think we want to convert non-emergency people who have said, I want to be non-emergency medical transport, and this is what I do. This is my business model. We don't want to convert them to something that could just be hailed on the street.
Right.
Necessarily. So, because they had proposed to take that out as well. And so this was kind of, keeping that there so that those services keep what they do specific. But again, if I turn my ankle on the sidewalk and I see a taxi driving by and, I'm like, I don't need an ambulance, but hey, I want to run over here to the urgent care, is the taxi not going to pick me up?
Right.
So, or do I have to sit down, call a phone, wait 30 minutes for somebody to show up, or, something like that. So,
Yeah. Counselors, you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess whether or not we use the word taxi or cab or anything like that, but do we have the ability to further define like clearly marked or kind of, because there is a little bit of reference to like the size, I think, of certain letters, but I think that refers to, and I mean, that's like 2.5 inches or anything like, or specific
Right.
to, I think, the owner's name or something like that. And so I guess when you just think of what clearly marked means and what is the threshold for that?
okay, yeah, they're in section 12-16-4.3. That's where it talks about they bear on each side letters, not less than 2.5 inches in height, the name of the owner or the trade name under which the owner does business, and a serial body number assigned by the owner to each taxi cab shall be displayed on each side and on the rear of the taxi cab. And that's just changing painted to displayed. And it's got to be contrasting so you can read it.
I guess is the 2.5 inches like adequate for, to cross the threshold of clearly marked?
That is the current standard. That part is not modified in the draft. That's the way it's been for years.
Okay. And then the other piece, I think, kind of was around the non-emergency medical transport. And I guess the reasoning why kind of changing that piece, and then almost, how are you define, I guess there was some definition, and I wasn't familiar with the NET program, Medicaid NET program, but so I don't know if there's some additional allowances under that, but, kind of as you define what, non-emergency medical transport. So I know they got a lot of ambulance services that specifically, deal in non-emergency transport.
Right.
So kind of trying to see what
in reviewing their proposed changes, I'll address, like how they're defined. I discovered that there were duplicate. There was a definition of non-emergency medical transport service, and then a little later there was medical transport service. So I combined those two definitions in the definition section that's on page 6 of the document, because somehow one of the many iterations of the ordinance, it appeared that got duplicated. There was a time at which the ordinance was separated out and had definitions of vehicles and then definitions of services. And years ago, those got merged together, and that may be why we wound up with duplicates on that. But I haven't dug deeply into the Medicaid NET program, but basically that's just a way to get reimbursement for someone who has to take transportation. It's not driving themselves or whatever, but it's to get reimbursed for their transportation expenses to doctor's appointments or whatever. And, I did check. What I saw doesn't seem to specifically designate the type of vehicle the person has to be transported in. I mean, the difference, an ambulance must be used if somebody has to be transported recumbent, which probably, they probably need some kind of medical support during the transport. The non-emergency medical could be anything from going to a doctor's appointment, going to dialysis, any number of things that you might be doing on a non-emergency basis. And the people are either going to be ambulatory, or if they need, a wheelchair or something, then the vehicle will have to be accessible for that.
Yeah, so that was kind of, I guess, my thinking when you're talking about ambulatory, words like prone, wheelchair accessible. Is it just on the, person calling for the service to kind of figure that out, or like where does that burden lie?
I think they're going to have to allow that. I understand that from Mr. Houston, who has had Yellow Cab here in the city for a long time, had approached us, about this, and he had mentioned they wanted sedan added into the vehicles that could be used previously for non-emergency. We required a van, minivan, or bus, or is an accessible vehicle. They wanted sedan in there. Apparently, he said they do use sedans to take people to dialysis now. So, that would open it up. I think a lot of the people who have come forward for CPNCs have had vans or, some other kind of accessible. But again, if I call up, then, they should be asking, do you need, wheelchair for assistance or anything like that? They should be asking those questions if somebody says, I need that. Because even just transporting somebody not for medical reasons, they still have to provide some accessible rides for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to grasp the underlying reasoning between why that change is even being requested, I guess, and so real world, like applicable.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Again, these are, based on what they asked for. There were some things they took out that definitely didn't make sense, but some of it, it's a policy call for the council to make if we want to make those changes. And unfortunately, they couldn't be here today. So.
Yeah, because like I said, I know, kind of like I said, you've got people that are in that lane as far as non-emergency transport that have to go through level of certification and training in order to. And so I guess there's no threshold.
I'm not aware of any particular training or certification for non-emergency medical.
Yeah, I've been to, and maybe it's not required, but I do think there is a threshold. I know I've been to a couple of the ones locally and kind of met with them. I know there's some, may not be a full EMS, but there's a couple of stepping up certifications.
There's no requirement in our ordinance for them to have any particular training for non-emergency.
You're just talking about to transport? To
transport, yeah, for non-emergency. For if somebody is recumbent, if they're not able to walk or function, in a wheelchair or with a walker or something like that, then they have to be transported by ambulance. There are non-emergency ambulance rides.
Correct.
But that's the differentiation. There is, if they have to be transported by ambulance, yes, then there would be training requirements for the people who work on the ambulances. But for what is defined as a non-emergency medical transport in our ordinance, there's no requirement for training. It's basically you're taking somebody to a wellness visit or, as I mentioned, like for dialysis, something like that. It's things that, it's just ordinary, something you might get in the car and, ride with your, son or daughter taking you to that appointment.
Right, well, that's what I'm saying. So, and I'm specifically talking to non-emergency ambulance services where they do have to have some training and certification versus, what we're saying non-emergency here, which is like a routine trip. Yeah. And so why would that need to be classified as emergency?
The ambulances are covered.
Medical transport.
Yeah, ambulances are covered under a different part of the code. There's a separate ordinance that governs ambulances for the city. And so if it's a non-emergency ambulance transport, then that's covered. Under city ordinance, only the city can transport emergency cases.
Well, what I'm talking about is like, as it relates to the taxi cabs. Why is there a need to differentiate, if we're talking about routine transport, like going to a doctor's appointment, why do we need to classify that as medical transport?
Okay, I'll let Jane, see if Mr. Fowler
I'm
can.
going to answer it with a question, and Julie, so you tell me if I'm wrong. So, not all non-emergency transport services want to operate as taxis, and so if someone wants to specifically do that, then we require them to come and get that certification, or whatever it is we require them to do. However, all taxis can pretty much provide that same service, and so I think this just clarifies that a taxi cab doesn't have to come and get that additional other certification that they can, because they can operate more broadly. So it just removes that confusion. It's not a separate service. It's just that when people want to specifically provide that non-emergency service, they have to come and get certified for that. But this taxi would also cover the taxis for doing that.
And as I understand it, it's amending the ordinance just to strike that from the ordinance. So basically, we're not adding, anything. We're just taking some wording out of the ordinance that was specifically, put in there but previously. So it's just deregulating it slightly. Yeah.
I think maybe, to Councilor Woods, yes, I think there is a question of, is there really a need for a separate classification for non-emergency medical services? But that was put in years ago. I wasn't involved in the decisions to make that in, so I can't answer why it's there.
Let me ask it this way. What will relieving this language allow them to do that they can't currently do?
So if you didn't, you're saying if you didn't strike that?
Yeah, by changing this language, what are we giving them the ability to do?
Probably you're not highly, unless somebody complained this taxi's operating as a non-emergency medical transport, and, Detective Pitts goes out and finds out they are. As I said, in most of these transactions, I don't think we really have visibility of what they're doing. Now, if a non-emergency medical transport is driving around waiting to be hailed, or sitting in a taxi stand for not prearranged rides, then, because if this all works together, there are taxi stands that are provided on the street, which only taxis are supposed to be utilizing, because they are on-demand vehicles. So there are a few other things that work together as a whole. So that would be one thing. The taxis could still be there for on-demand, but again, I don't think we're going to have visibility if, and maybe the taxi doesn't necessarily. If I say, hey, I'm in Eastlake, I need to go to Southside, and I don't, when I arrange the ride, and I don't tell them I'm going to the professional building at St. Vincent's, then, how do we know that? How do we regulate that anyway? So yes, I think it's possible that's going on anyway. If I call up an Uber, and I need a ride to a doctor or something, we don't have visibility of that either. So this just takes that language out so it's clear. And basically what we're talking here are what are the CP&Cs, which is what we approve with the resolution that comes before council, is a certificate of public necessity and convenience. And that concept came in many, many decades ago to allow the regulation of traffic, as some of the research I've done in the history of CPNCs was back in the Depression, all of a sudden, anybody who had a car who lost a job were getting out on the street and picking people up to drive. And it was hurting the taxi industry. There were also questions about safety and all of that. And so the CPNC concept came in to help regulate the number of vehicles that are on the roads and providing transportation. We don't have a plethora in Birmingham of taxis out there operating. I don't know, from Detective Pitts, what we've seen as far as increases in vehicles, because you've now got Uber and Lyft and, perhaps other TNCs out there operating. But that's what you're talking about. So, certificate of public necessity and convenience is keeping the city aware of how many vehicles are out there operating on city streets and in governing some of that.
I guess one more question, but do we know how big of an influx they were interested in bringing into Birmingham? Is that something that came up?
They essentially want to partner with the main taxi cab operator, and I forget how many vehicles he has, but they wanted to start with essentially that fleet. And so I don't know that it's intended to flood the market, but taking over, partnering with that existing fleet.
If I recall, they had they had a small amount of vehicles that they were going to come in, and then they were going to build on it. But like I said, unfortunately, they weren't able to be here, but there's a plan. Hopefully they will be here when it moves to council to answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So this wouldn't affect any of the existing other taxi cab companies out there. They would continue to operate as normal, with the light on top, and it doesn't seem like there's, except for yellow cab, there's not really uniformity in what a taxi cab looks like, in the city of Birmingham. But in any case, the way the amendments to the ordinance are written wouldn't, change anything for people who have been operating their taxi cab for the same way since, 1957 or whatever. The draft that we were initially given just struck completely a lot of that information. But my concern was there may be some who are still operating, who have that equipment. Right.
I don't know what the condition of that equipment is, if it's being, how it's being maintained or anything, but if they still have the equipment, we didn't just want to write it off. And perhaps they will modernize, as they move forward, and we can make some more adjustments. But I was trying to make it more of an either-or situation. Either you have a taxi meter and you operate under the taxi meter provisions, or you use the third-party GPS to calculate your distances. And I will say that there's another provision in here. They had asked to completely strike the language about having a spare and a jack. And they said their company philosophy is they don't want people changing tires on the side of the road for safety. They want them to call the tow truck and have it handled. But my concern was, if you've already got a spare and a jack, I don't want to take out the language that says you have to keep the spare in good condition, and if you've got a spare, you got to have a jack, because some people may still have that. I understand the safety concern, and that may not be a bad idea, but if they're not operating under the same model, we need to leave that open for how others are operating.
I did have a question about the meters. So the ordinance is being amended such that the old-fashioned meter would not be required inside the vehicle. So how, that's inherently part of using a taxi is that the customer kind of knows, what they're being charged, right in front of them. They can see it as it's
Yeah.
going up. How is that accomplished in this new context?
Well, I think, same thing, if you've got an Uber or Lyft, you don't have that meter running. You've got your app. And I haven't looked specifically at how their app operates, but they've still got to give notice of what the fare rates are, and they've got to give people notice that they're using the third-party GPS app for calculating
Yeah.
the distances.
So what
So,
what makes them different from Uber and Lyft, though, is that people, this is going to be a local company that somebody can call on a telephone and make arrangements for a ride. So conceivably, there's going to be, part of their customer base that's not going to have the ability to sort of keep track of where they are, in real time using a GPS-enabled device. So, to me, that's sort of significantly changing the model in that, again, the customer doesn't have the visibility, or conceivably in a situation where you have a customer who's called in and requested a ride, made arrangements for a ride, they don't have that sort of real-time visibility if they don't have that GPS-enabled
Yeah.
device.
yeah. Again, unfortunately, I'm not able to answer those questions. Those are questions that perhaps they could answer, and I don't have the answers for exactly how that functions. They may have a good answer for that. So,
I think under this model, you would not be able to call and book a ride and call and book
Yeah.
a ride.
at least according to what I've seen on their website and the information, that they sent us, but according to, I've looked at where they're operating. As I mentioned, they're operating in Mobile, and I looked at their website, and there's a phone number. There's an option there. I think one thing that differentiates them in some ways, your question is very good, but whereas, like, say, Uber or Lyft are companies where they provide a platform, and someone with a personal vehicle can sign up on that platform, and they use their personal vehicle to drive people. This model is not asking to be considered a transportation network company. They're willing to be under a lot of the same regulations as taxis. The difference is they do have the ride-hailing app, and I think Yellow Cab may have had a ride-hailing app for a while, but they're willing to still have their drivers treated as taxi drivers. They are providing the fleet instead of somebody bringing their individual car to the business. So they're providing their fleet, and then the drivers, as you know, a lot of taxi companies, the drivers are contract employees anyway, but they're contracted rather than being just an independent person who signs up on the app and anybody can get a ride with them. So I think that's some of the difference in the business model. It's not all the way into being a TNC. It's still operating as a taxi. They're still, they haven't asked to be taken out of any of the requirements for the driver permits or any of the other things. They just wanted mostly these modifications to the physical requirements.
Yeah, so, generally speaking, I think that it's great, and I think, the taxi cab industry in Birmingham has definitely needed to respond to, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world and to modernize because, quite frankly, they've been irrelevant for most of the market that uses, a ride for hire system. So I welcome that part of it, but I do, I think the most outstanding question that I have is that, since that meter, and maybe it's, just the old mechanical meter that we're not requiring. Maybe they're going to have, an iPad or something mounted on the dashboard that's providing that information to the customer. I don't know, but that's one of the questions that I kind of think is outstanding. That's so. If there are no additional questions, what's the pleasure of the committee?
I'll just add a comment to what you just said, but you may be able to spell out the acceptable. So in addition to the current meter style, add in some detail about the system that they're going to employ, and just add in detail. You have to have one of these options. Is this just a presentation, or is this something to?
So there.
They would like to move it forward. And what I was doing is I was noting Councilor Quinn's question about the taxi meter versus GPS and how the customer sees the real-time calculation of the fare. I made a note of Councilor Wood's question about non-emergency medical. Was that answered? Did we answer that adequately, or do you still have?
I mean, it doesn't sound like it has a major impact, but I'm just not clear on the reason behind the request.
Okay, yeah, tried to explain it as best we could. Unfortunately, I said they're not here. But and as I mentioned, under the city's ambulance ordinance, which is under chapter 12.2 in the city code, that specifies that the only entity that can transport emergency patients is the Birmingham Fire and Rescue Service. All other ambulances that operate in the city are used for non-emergency transports, like hospital to hospital transfer, nursing home to hospital, transfers is what they're used for. So there is kind of a non-emergency component, but those are. If the patient requires some kind of basic medical support, they're recumbent, prone, they can't sit up in a vehicle, then those have to be through an ambulance. But those are the two things. Birmingham Fire and Rescue responds to all emergency calls for the city, unless they're overwhelmed. If it was mass casualty or something like that, then they would call on, other ambulance companies to assist. But that's how it's laid out for other medical transport.
Councilor Tate.
And Attorney Bernard, when, I know traveling a lot, I've used Lyft and Uber and know the rate, that I'm being charged. So how would the patron know the rate that they're being charged? Would it be similar, like, if I call you and I said I want to go from North Birmingham to the south side, is it going to be a situation like that?
The rates are still set by the city. We have a maximum charge that taxis can charge. By state law, we can't regulate what transportation network companies charge.
So that's $3 for the first quarter mile and 25 cents for each additional 1/8 mile to be adjusted annually according to the price of unleaded gasoline.
And they had actually asked for the provisions. I will go ahead and let the committee know. They had asked for those provisions to be struck about the adjustment. they were okay with leaving the rates of fare and everything, but they had asked for all of that to be struck regarding the rates, changing the rates of fare, adjusting. A lot of that was done a number of years ago when we had another spike in gasoline rates, and there was concern. They're like, your gasoline's going up. We can't afford to drive people for what these rates are. But my understanding is we haven't used that provision in probably since it was enacted. But I said, why would we want to take that out? I mean, if we want to adjust it, I didn't want to spend the time in getting into the fine details. And they were like, okay, well, leave that in. But that was put in at the request of the taxi companies at that time. Mm-hmm. And, it's like that was there to benefit you. Otherwise, you're stuck and you're going to have to come back and beg. So that may be something we want to discuss about, looking at those rates with where things are now. So I just want to point that out. That was one thing we left in that they had asked to take out, and they were just taking it out just because we haven't used it. But just because we haven't used it doesn't mean it's a bad idea.
Just to follow up on Councilor Tate's question. So you had asked about, how would someone know what they're being charged? So if they're using the app will tell you before it starts, calculates it. And it sounds like what we need to add in there is a clarification that if someone calls and is not using the app, that they are required to be notified of their rate up front. Yeah. And I would imagine that the cab companies are good with that, but we can confirm that. But it sounds like that's an addition that we need to make so that everything's transparent regarding the rates.
Yeah, I mean...
We still know what the rates are, but y'all are wanting to know, how does that person know what they're being charged based on the distance they've traveled and that rate they're supposed to be charged?
Right. So for example, Mrs. Jones calls and she, requests a taxi, and she's headed to the grocery store, and she's got, $15, and if all she's got is $15 and no debit card or anything like that, she needs to stop the taxi before she gets in a bad situation,
Yeah. And if she's going to the grocery store that's 3 miles away and the fare is $3 per mile, and all of a sudden she's being told she owes $16, then she needs to know where that happened, how that happened.
Right.
And have that dealt with. So yeah, we can look at that. We can do.
It's like a relatively simple modification that if somebody's not using a taxi meter, then they're required to notify the rider in advance of what the trip costs.
Yeah, and I don't know, I mean, I didn't scrutinize the amendments, the draft amendments to the ordinance, but I know that it did remove the strict requirement for that mechanical meter inside the vehicle, but I don't know if Z-Trips, what their business model is. This may be a really simple answer in that they say, yes, we're going to have a device inside the vehicle that's going to display the information, but without having them here, we don't know that. But even if they did, I think, that's an important consideration for us, is that, people who are using a taxi, they're likely, or they may fall into that category that they're not going to have a GPS, enabled device with an app. So that's something that we need to think about in the context of the ordinance.
I think, so Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, it's either or, so they have to have the GPS tracked system or a meter. So you couldn't just get rid of your meter without having the GPS enabled app.
Yeah, but as they're saying, if you're the buyer and you don't have a smartphone and using the app in that situation, then you want to be able to have that person to see the real-time calculation of the cost of that fare.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so, I'll find that section. I left in, I think I added this section on page 19. It's under the taxi meter section. It's the E, paragraph E, that says they have to notify the police if they're going to discontinue using a taxi meter and calculate distances by the third-party GPS technology. Said reader shall be informed of the method used to calculate distances before initiating the ride. And as Mr. Fowler said, we can add something that, requires them to know what the cost of that ride is. And I think I've understood from what I read. And again, I'm trying not to be the company representative, but I'm just trying to, in interest of, committee's understanding the things that we have been told. They don't have, and that I've read on their website, they don't have like surge pricing or
Right.
that some of the TNCs have. They're
Right.
straight across the board taxi fares. So my understanding, that's not part of their business model. Now, I can't say
Right.
somebody else wouldn't do that or they don't change, but that's currently apparently not part of their business model.
Right.
So. But we can add something in. We can contact the representatives and let them know the committee's concern and try to see if we can get that answered or, add something in that'll work.
Yeah, it seems like that we would add riders shall be informed of the method used to calculate distances as well as the cost of the ride before initiating a ride. Additional phrase there.
Okay. All right. What's the pleasure of the committee?
I think we can move this full council. I move approval pending some of the discussed changes.
Second.
All right. Have a motion and proper second. All in favor say aye. Aye. That motion passes. Thank you. Old and new business. Would like to announce that our next regularly scheduled Transportation Committee meeting will be December 13th. So the committee meetings will be the second and fourth Mondays of each month at 2 p.m., provided that we have, business. Would like to recognize Mr. Brett Wood, who is the interim CEO for Birmingham Parking Authority, and board chair, Mr. Kevin Owens. So you may have heard that the BPA has been going through some transition, and they recently named Mr. Andre Davis as the incoming CEO. And Mr. Davis, I believe, starts in March. Is that correct, Mr. Owens? Yes, March 1st. So Mr. Davis is currently the Director of Transportation for UAB. And so the two entities that the Transportation Committee solicits and reviews applicants for appointment are the BJCTA and the Birmingham Parking Authority. Those are the two main ones. Now, there may be some defunct boards out there that we have purview over, but those are the two main ones. And I believe some of the parking authority appointments are nearing expiration, so those will be coming up in the future as well. But if there's no additional new or old business, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move adjournment.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.